My daughter sold my wife's Rolex for $800 and told me to stop living in the past. But hidden inside that very watch was a code to a $2.6 million account my wife had kept secret. What began as a betrayal over a simple watch turned into a war for millions. This was just the beginning. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. I sat in the living room that Helen and I had shared for over 4 decades, the air still heavy with her absence. The old armchair across from me, the one she used to curl into with her knitting, was empty now, as it had been every evening since she passed. On the mantel above the fireplace, our wedding picture sat in its wooden frame, the edges worn smooth from years of being dusted. Helen's smile in that photo had always been my anchor. Tonight, though, staring into that frozen smile, all I could feel was the sharp sting of betrayal from my own daughter. Laura had taken something sacred, something that belonged not just to me, but to our family history, and pawned it for a vacation. A Rolex Submariner from 1978, the watch Helen had surprised me with when Laura was just a toddler. I could still remember the day Helen presented it to me, how proud she looked as she clasped it around my wrist. It had cost Frank 3 months of overtime pay back then, but it was more than a timepiece. It was the heartbeat of our marriage, wound carefully each morning, a reminder of how far we had come together. And now it was gone. My daughter had sold it for $800. $800, not even a fraction of its real worth. I thought back to all the sacrifices Helen and I had made for Laura. $60,000 for her college tuition, a degree she had once sworn would make her independent. $25,000 for her first car, a shiny red Toyota she drove with reckless pride. $40,000 for her wedding, an event that Helen and I had insisted on covering even though it drained nearly all of our savings at the time. We told ourselves it was worth it, that giving our daughter the best start in life was our duty. Now, sitting alone in the same room where Laura's wedding photos still hung, I whispered under my breath, "Helen, did you see this? We gave her everything, and this is how she repays us." The betrayal gnawed at me in layers. It wasn't just the watch, it was the house too. This very house, worth $600,000, the place where Laura grew up, where we had Christmas dinners and birthday parties, where Helen had painted the kitchen yellow because she said it made mornings brighter. I could feel Laura and Brian circling it like vultures. Their eyes weren't on memories. They were on numbers, on dollar signs, on what they believed they were owed. The thought of them selling these walls, these floors that I had laid with my own 2 hands in 1992, filled me with a bitterness I had never known before. I traced my fingers along the arm of the sofa, the fabric still faintly smelling of Helen's favorite lavender spray. The Rolex had been the first to go, but I knew it wouldn't be the last. Laura and Brian were not just greedy, they were plotting. I remembered Brian's casual smirk when he said, "You should think about moving into a retirement place, George. Less stress for everyone." Less stress for him, maybe, more control over what I had left. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about memories, it was about power. It was about control. The Rolex was only the beginning. I could see the shift in my own mind, as though the grief that had weighed me down these past 6 months began to reshape into something else. At first it was a shock, then it became anger. Now it was suspicion. Laura wasn't just trying to erase Helen's memory from my wrist. She was trying to erase me from my own life. As the golden light of the late afternoon filtered through the curtains, it fell across the old stack of folders I kept on the bookshelf. Bills, receipts, and records from decades of careful saving. I had always been the one who managed the finances, who made sure we had enough for groceries, for Laura's dance lessons, for every emergency that came our way. I picked up my coffee cup, the ceramic chipped at the handle, and it rattled against the saucer as my hand shook. Each sip was bitter, not from the coffee, but from the memories that came rushing back. Helen and I are cutting coupons at the kitchen table, her voice teasing me about being too frugal. I stayed late at the bank, crunching numbers while she put Laura to bed. I had worked hard, saved carefully, invested in stability, only for my daughter to treat it all like spare change. On the bookshelf, the old tuition receipts were still there, yellowing with age. I pulled one out, stared at the amount, $15,000 for a single semester. I whispered again, this time louder. She doesn't see me as her father anymore. I'm just a burden, a wallet. The realization sank in slowly but deeply. Laura wasn't clinging to her mother's memory. She wasn't trying to honor what Helen and I had built. She was dismantling it piece by piece. And worse, she was doing it with that same cold voice Helen used to warn me about, the one that dripped with condescension every time she said, "Dad, you just don't understand." I stood and walked toward the cabinet where Helen had kept our photo albums. The wood creaked as I opened it, the smell of old paper and polish rising. Inside, tucked between family photos, was something I hadn't noticed before. An envelope, the edges frayed, Helen's handwriting across the front. For George, when the time comes. My chest tightened as I slid it free, my fingers trembling. I hadn't seen this before. I hadn't been ready to. But now, with Laura's betrayal still raw, it felt like Helen had left it for this exact moment. I opened it carefully, half afraid the paper would crumble. Inside was a short note, written in the neat script Helen always used when she wanted me to take something seriously. If you are reading this, it means everything we feared has come to pass. Don't give up, George. Look deeper. My eyes stung, not from age, but from the sudden wave of grief. She had known. Somehow, she had known that one day Laura's greed would outweigh her love. I sat back down, clutching the note, and looked around the room again. The house wasn't just wood and nails. It was Helen's laughter echoing down the hall, Laura's school projects still pinned to the corkboard in the study, the sizzle of Sunday pancakes in the kitchen. And now all of it was at risk. $600,000, a home full of memories, and a savings account I had guarded for decades. They wanted it all, but they would have to get through me first. The anger inside me shifted again, no longer the blind rage of betrayal, but a sharper, colder resolve. Laura and Brian thought I was weak, that I was too old, too grief-stricken, too confused to fight back. But I had been a banker for 40 years. I knew how money moved, how paper trails worked, how to hide something in plain sight. If Helen had left me a clue, then there was more to find, and I was going to find it. The room darkened as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor I had installed myself back in '92. Each plank I nailed down with my own hands, each groove reminding me of the sweat and care I had poured into this place. I wasn't just protecting a house, I was protecting a life's work. I could hear Helen's voice in my mind, soft but firm. Don't let them take what we built. On the mantel, the clock ticked steadily, each second a reminder that time was moving forward, whether I was ready or not. I took one last sip of cold coffee and set the cup down, my decision made. This betrayal would not end with me sitting quietly in my chair. I would dig into every record, every receipt, every note Helen had left behind. And when I found what Laura and Brian were after, I would use it not just to protect myself, but to remind them that family is built on respect, not on greed. As I closed Helen's letter and slid it back into its envelope, I knew this was only the beginning. Tomorrow I would go through the rest of the files in my office. Tomorrow I will find the truth hidden in the numbers. For tonight, though, I let the weight of the day settle around me, whispering into the quiet room, "We're not done yet, Helen. Not by a long shot." I returned to the pawn shop the next morning with a notebook in my coat pocket and a steadier kind of anger. The bell over the door rang once. Glass cases held guitars, class rings, and old cameras. Danny looked up, closed his ledger, and set a velvet tray on the counter. The tray was empty. He tapped the spot where a bracelet would rest and said he had serviced the watch, cleaned the case, and noted the serial. He reached under the counter and handed me a thin manila envelope with my name penciled on it. Inside were 3 tiny screws, a back plate polished like a coin, and a folded slip of paper. I opened it. SS4457, CH0815GR. Helen's careful hand. Below it, a date I knew by heart. So 8:15, August 15th, the night we met by the lake. Danny said the buyer had paid cash and asked only about recent Rolexes. I thanked him, slipped the paper into my notebook, and stepped into the Chicago cold. Back home, I cleared the dining table and set Helen's Bible in the center. I laid the back plate on a saucer from our wedding china and smoothed the slip across the leather cover. Helen never did random. She labeled boxes, balanced checkbooks, and saved warranty cards. SS CH0815GR. It was speaking in her voice. My phone lit up. Laura. Her name filled the screen like a storm. I answered. She said the house looked crowded and sad, that she and Brian could help me simplify. Then her tone cooled. Dad, you don't really understand money now. There are so many rules. Give us the paperwork and we'll keep things from getting messy. I stared at the slip while she talked and heard the words she didn't say. Old, slow, in the way. I ended the call before my voice broke. I carried Helen's laptop to the desk where the afternoon light fell softly across the keys. I typed the string into a site whose name sounded like a locked door, Secure Solutions Investment Management. The box asked for a client number. The string fit. The page asked for a password. I tried the month and day, then the year we married, then the year Laura was born. On the 4th try, the screen changed. Current balance, $2,657,492. I leaned back until the chair complained. Not a dream. A tide. Big enough to lift a life, big enough to drown a scheme. She had left the trail inside a watch our daughter thought was nothing but grief jewelry. My first impulse was to call and shout. My second saved me. This was not the time to gloat. This was the time to plan. I printed the account overview, the transaction history, and a summary letter dated 3 months before Helen died. It listed conservative funds, municipal bonds, an annuity ladder, and 2 deposits labeled by code. The totals matched the big number. Paper steadied me. I called Thomas Chen because his card sat with our wills. He is a quiet man with a courtroom jaw and a way of listening that makes you tell the whole truth. He offered an appointment that afternoon. Bring what matters, he said, and write down any pressure you get. I wrote down every word from Laura's call. Before leaving, I called my bank. I added a verbal password, text alerts for withdrawals over $1,000, and a face-to-face-to-face only flag for ownership changes. Ordinary steps, but ordinary can be a fortress. Chen's office sits on the 12th floor of a building with brass handles buffed by worried hands. He shook mine like an old neighbor and led me to a table under a clean lamp. I laid out the printouts, the pawn slip, and the folded scrap. He studied the string, the date, the initials, then nodded. Your wife was a planner. He asked to run a quiet check on Brian and to look for filings under Laura's name. He handed me a page titled Immediate Steps and marked boxes as we spoke. If anyone shows up with forms, call me before you sign, he said, or after, preferably before. When I got home, the answering machine blinked red. Laura again. The new message was shorter and colder. She said friends understood elder finances and advised against rash moves that might complicate the transfer of property. She said the market was hot, and Brian knew an agent who could list the house by Friday. I opened the linen drawer where Helen kept table runners and found an envelope clipped to an old restaurant menu. Inside was a list of addresses with tiny coded notes. Some I knew, some I did not. Helen had been tracing something. The phone rang again. I picked up on the second ring. Laura asked if I had found anything in the watch. The question felt like a draft under the door. I kept my voice mild. I said I had found a few numbers I did not understand and had thrown them away because the ink smeared. Silence, then a tight little laugh. Dad, you really should let us handle this. I told her I would think about it and set the receiver down with care. My hands were not shaking anymore. I needed more than a big balance on a screen. I needed a story that would stand when someone pushed. I sorted the printouts by date, cross-checked deposits against Helen's list, and wrote a timeline in a ruled notebook. 2 deposits matched 2 addresses. The codes echoed the initials on the scrap. It was enough for now. At dusk, Thomas called back. His voice carried the edge I used to hear in my own when a loan file didn't smell right. Brian carried roughly $180,000 in gambling debt with online books and private markers. A company called Sullivan Investments had been registered 8 months earlier using a mailbox store and a virtual office. Inquiries in Laura's name had gone to 2 elder law firms, asking about guardianship, about challenging capacity, about springing powers of attorney. I thanked him and sat very still at the kitchen table while the refrigerator hummed like a faraway train. I made a list for the morning because lists build ladders when the ground feels uncertain. Visit the branch to confirm protections. Call the county office to check for forged requests. Change the backdoor deadbolt because Brian once joked about losing a spare key. Photocopy the deed. Scan Helen's note and store it in 2 places, one obvious and one not. Sandbag before a flood. Build every line. Sleep came thin. I woke before dawn and made eggs because eggs are a small choice you can control. At 9, I sat with the branch manager who had known us for years. He added the verbal password, flagged my account, and printed confirmations. He told me to call him directly if anyone tried anything clever. I walked into bright winter light, feeling an inch taller. On the way home, I drove past the pawn shop and parked without going in. I stared at the sign and imagined the stranger who had bought the watch. I hoped he wore it with respect. Then I reminded myself that the watch had completed its final task. It had delivered the message. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 1 below to let me know you're here with me. Early afternoon, Laura texted, "Call me. We need to make adult decisions." I did not reply. She called. I answered because you cannot win if you refuse to step on the field. She asked what time she and Brian could stop by to go through Mom's files. I told her I had moved everything into temporary storage while I reorganized. She scoffed and said Brian believed we could sell the house quickly if we listed soon. I said the house was not for sale. She exhaled hard. "You're being emotional," she said. "This is about numbers," I answered, "that numbers and memories can share a roof," wished her a good afternoon, and hung up. A courier arrived before sunset with a letter on Chen's letterhead stating I had retained counsel and directing any questions about capacity or estate to him. I made 3 copies, one for my wallet, one for the hall closet above the keys, one for the top drawer by the door. Enclosed was a checklist titled Security. It told me to freeze my credit profiles and place a hold on change of address orders at the post office. I completed both before dinner. When the street lights came on, I spread Helen's addresses beside the Cayman statements and drew faint pencil lines between them. Some entries matched places we had driven past on Sunday afternoons, properties that looked tired then and handsome now. I could see Helen on the page, steady and patient, using the world's language for protection. Title, date, balance. I put the folder in the small fire safe behind the coat rack and slid the original scrap into my notebook. I hid the notebook in the freezer behind a bag of peas because Helen once swore freezers were where people never look for serious things. I smiled at the memory and missed her harder. Before D, I stood in the hallway and listened to the old wood settle. Houses remember. I spoke softly toward the dark because saying it out loud stiffened my spine. "They think I'm weak," I said. "They think I'm alone. They think grief made me blind. They are wrong." I sat at the desk and wrote one clean sentence on a fresh page, the last line of the day and the start of whatever will follow. They don't know I'm holding the one thing that will change everything. After dinner, I called the firm that hosted the Cayman account. I asked for a paper statement to be mailed directly to Thomas Chen's office and for online access to remain as is. The representative confirmed my identity with questions only Helen would have written down and read the request back without a ripple in her voice. Systems like that do not care about family storms, and the steadiness settled me. I set an alert on the county recorder's site for any filing that mentioned my name or this address. One forged paper can tilt a house worth $600,000. I printed the confirmation and clipped it to the deed. The small metal bite of the stapler sounded like a fence post being driven straight. In the morning, I changed the deadbolt on the back door. The screwdriver slipped once, leaving a minor scratch I will always notice. I stood with the new key in my palm and felt how a simple turn can say, "This door answers to me." Across the street, Mrs. Patterson lifted a hand. I waved back and kept moving. At the table, I rehearsed the next talk with Laura. I practiced saying no and letting silence carry its own weight. I wrote a line and underlined it. They think I have lost. The game has only begun. Thomas emailed a draft he would send if anyone tried to challenge my capacity. It referenced recent in-person banking, a clean cognitive screen, and a letter from my doctor. He did not send it to scare me. He sent it so I could see the scaffolding rising. I slid the pages to the front of the folder. That afternoon, the branch manager called to confirm the flags on my accounts were active. He promised his staff would require me in person for any ownership change. I thanked him by name and felt the house exhale. Or maybe that was me. Near midnight, my phone buzzed. A short text from Laura. "We're coming by tomorrow. Noon." Not a request, a notice. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway until my eyes adjusted. "You left me tools, not just memories," I told Helen. "I won't waste them." They arrived at noon, Laura a step ahead of Brian, as if she were dragging him into a photograph she had already arranged in her mind. I had opened the windows to let the winter light spill across the living room and make the old maple floors shine. Helen used to say, "A room that breathes tells the truth." I wanted this room to breathe when my daughter walked in. The folder on the coffee table was squared to the edge. The curtains were drawn back. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and coffee. Before the bell rang, I had taken a slow walk to the sidewalk and back. Mrs. Patterson caught me at the gate and reached for my sleeve. Her eyes softened the way people do when they think they are helping. She said Laura had told the neighbors I had been forgetting things. She said people were talking about me mixing up electric and gas bills, about me repeating the same story at the block party, about the time I left the porch light on all night and swore I had turned it off twice. She said she worried. She said maybe a move would be good for me. She meant well, but the words burned. I thanked her and said the bills were paid. I told her the porch light was fixed. I told her I still knew the names of the birds that visit my feeder. I walked back inside with a new kind of resolve, the kind that sits behind the ribs and waits until it is needed. The bell sounded 3 short notes. I opened the door and stepped aside so Laura and Brian had to enter my space at my pace. Laura kissed the air next to my cheek and did a quick inventory with her eyes as if the walls were numbers. Brian called me sir and headed for the kitchen, distracted by the refrigerator magnet shaped like a trout. I guided them back to the living room and took my chair by the window. They sat on the couch without waiting for me to invite them. The old house groaned once and held still, just listening. Laura started with kindness, the way a salesman starts with a compliment. She said the house felt heavy. She said grief lived in these rooms. She said a smaller place would be easier. She said the market was hot, that a friend could list the house and get multiple offers, and that we could close in a week if I were decisive. While she spoke, she picked up one of Helen's ceramic coasters and traced the blue pattern with her thumb, like she owned the story printed there. Then she asked if I had found anything else in the watch, not in a direct way, not the way a person asks about a memory. She asked if maybe there had been a service card tucked inside, a receipt, a note that could help with insurance. She tried to make it sound casual and failed. I watched her hands more than I watched her face. I let the silence earn its place. Then I reached into the folder and drew out the first page. It was a letter on Thomas Chen's stationery. The header made Brian straighten up. The first line identified me by name and address. The second line stated that Mr. Chen represented me in all matters related to my finances and estate. The third line directed all questions to his office. I did not add commentary. I set the letter on the table between us and folded my hands. Laura's smile narrowed. Brian leaned in, then leaned back. I kept my voice even and warm. I told them I appreciated their concern. I told them I would not be signing or selling anything today. I told them my lawyer would handle communication. I told them we could speak about holidays and memories, but not about assets. Laura asked why I had hired a lawyer, as if that decision were an insult to the family. I told her grown people use professionals when pressure shows up at their door. Then I slid out the second sheet, a summary of my protections. My bank accounts required in-person authorization with a password. My credit files were frozen. The county recorder had alerts set for my name and for this parcel, the small square of Chicago, where I have paid taxes since 1987. I read each item once. I watched the information land on their faces like snow. That means something. Brian said we were overreacting, that nobody wanted to hurt me, that this was about efficiency. I let his words fade. The third item in the folder was an envelope printed with the name Sullivan Investments, LLC. I had done my reading. I told them what I had learned in the same calm tone I use when checking a fence for weak boards. The company was formed 8 months ago using a mailbox at a storefront that also sells lottery tickets and notary stamps. It had moved money quickly through short-term property deals that never lingered long enough to collect dust. The listed manager had the same last name as my family. I set the envelope down as if it were a small stone and not a piece of a wall I was building. Laura said corporate structures are complex. She said friends had explained how families protect assets. She said rumors about gambling debts are simply rumors. She said this in a voice that had persuaded me to let her stay out past curfew when she was 16. I had learned a lot since then. I told her what Thomas had told me. $180,000 in losses, recorded with online books and private markers. 2 inquiries in her name to elder law attorneys about guardianship and competency petitions. 3 banks verified employment information for Brian that did not match the numbers on his own returns. I said these were not rumors. I said they were records. Helen knew, I said, and the sentence filled the room. The stillness after that was strong enough to lean against. I said my wife saw more than people believed she saw. I said she left information with counsel. I did not say numbers. I did not say where the trail had led. I let them draw their own shadows. Brian's Adam's apple jumped. Laura's color rose. That was when the doorbell rang again. 3 quick presses. I opened the door to a woman in a navy suit and a young man holding a leather portfolio. She introduced herself as Catherine Wells. She said she represented my daughter regarding sensitive family matters. I let them step inside and stop on the entry rug. I did not invite them deeper. Catherine praised my home, praised my service to my community, praised my obvious dignity, and in the next breath described how complicated finances can become a burden. She said a temporary arrangement would spare everyone stress. She slid a packet from the portfolio as if it might purr once set on my table. I asked whether I had signed an engagement letter authorizing her to speak for me. She smiled and said this was merely a courtesy call. I asked whether she intended to file a petition to test my capacity. She smiled again and said, only if it was in everyone's best interest. I told her that any such petition would open discovery. I told her the discovery would open accounts. I told her accounts would open patterns. I told her patterns have a way of telling the truth. No one wants to read into the record. The young man shifted his weight. Catherine's smile held, but the corners turned brittle. Catherine slid the packet closer and said the document was a springing power of attorney, narrowly tailored, activating only if a physician certified a need. She said it was like an umbrella kept in the car for bad weather. I said my umbrella was already open. I took a plastic case from the entry table and held it in my palm. Inside was a flash drive labeled in Helen's handwriting. I did not pass it over. I let it live in the spaces between our eyes. I said my attorney had copies of everything he needed. I said I had copies too. I said some were here and some were not here. The room understood me. I read aloud 2 sentences from Thomas's letter, the one mailed and emailed the night before. The first directed the immediate end of any rumor campaign suggesting cognitive decline or unfitness. The second warned that any attempt to procure signatures under pressure would be preserved as evidence of undue influence for presentation to appropriate authorities. I did not raise my voice. I let each word land fully before I offered the next. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 2 below to let me know you're here with me. Laura made a sound I had not heard since she was a little girl who wanted a toy I would not buy. She accused me of listening to outsiders. She called me stubborn and ungrateful. She said this would be easier if I cooperated. I told her love does not always sound like yes. I told her boundaries are a kind of love too, the kind that keeps people from hurting themselves. Brian said they were simply trying to help, that I was making a mountain out of paperwork. He said listing the house now would be a smart financial choice. I told him this house is not a choice. It is a promise I made to Helen and to myself. I turned to Catherine and asked if she wanted to read the documents now or later at counsel's office. She said later. I told her she should know my bank had flagged all accounts for in-person authorization. I told her the county would alert me within the hour if anyone filed a deed. I told her that any title company that called would find Thomas answering. Every sentence was a step up a staircase that had no broken boards. She tried one more angle. She said, even the best men grow tired under the weight of paperwork. She said daughters are responsible for their fathers. She tilted the word responsible until it almost sounded like righteous. I told her my daughter was responsible for her own choices. I told her if anyone filed something ugly against me, the ugliness would stick to their hands. I told her the kindest thing I could do for my daughter now was to tell her the truth and stay standing. They did not like that, not any of it. You could feel the heat leave the room as their plan lost air. Catherine gathered her packet and said she would be in touch. I pointed to Thomas's letter on the table and reminded her of the address. She gave me a professional nod that contained more frost than respect and stepped back onto the porch. The young man followed her like a shadow that was ready to be a shadow somewhere else. Laura did not leave. Pride held her in place like a pin through a butterfly wing. She told me she loved me. She told me I was making this ugly. She told me I would regret letting strangers come between us. I said the only thing between us was her choices. I said I would not apologize for protecting what her mother and I built. I said she ought to find a mirror and ask the person in it whether love wears shoes with spikes. Brian touched her elbow, and they finally moved down the walk. At the gate, Laura turned and raised her voice so the cold could carry it to the porches. She said the neighborhood would hear how cruel I had become. I thought of Mrs. Patterson, of the soft way she had told me other people's words. I answered loud enough for my neighbor to hear. I said kindness would be measured by the truth from now on. When the door was closed and the deadbolt clicked, the house exhaled. I stood with my hand flat against the wood and felt the small thrum of something that might have been relief. Then I carried the folder to the dining table, dialed Thomas, and gave him the entire account in the order it happened. He listened without interruption. He asked me to scan and send the unsigned packet. He said he would courier 2 letters by evening, one to Catherine confirming representation and boundaries, one to the clerk of court, noting that any petition to test my capacity would be met with evidence and requests of our own. He asked whether I wanted him to contact the district attorney's office. I told him I wanted to give Laura one chance to stop before the machine started. He said, mercy is not weakness when it is timed correctly. He also told me to document everything. I looked at the table and realized I had already done that without being told. After the call, I made tea and stood by the window where the winter sun turned the maple floors into something warm and honest. Laura walked across to Mrs. Patterson's porch and started talking with quick hands. Mrs. Patterson looked at me instead of at my daughter. I raised a hand. Laura noticed the gesture and broke off mid-sentence. She hugged our neighbor without meaning it and left in a hurry. I do not like confrontation, but sometimes the truth has to stand on two legs where everyone can see it. I spent an hour building a packet for Thomas. Copies of the letter on his stationery, copies of the county alert confirmations, photos of the unsigned packet on the entry rug so he could see where and how it arrived. A timeline in ordinary language, times, names, events, no adjectives. The work calmed me in the same way sanding does. You move the paper until the roughness stops arguing. At 7, a courier in a navy jacket delivered a blue envelope. Inside was Thomas's formal notice to Catherine. It said what the email had said, but the ink and the seal gave it more weight. Further attempts to interfere with Mr. Sullivan's decisions will be treated as undue influence and referred to the appropriate authorities. I set the letter on the mantel next to our wedding photo. For a moment, the room felt like a church. I turned off the lamps, checked the lock on the back door, and opened the freezer long enough to touch the spine of the notebook behind a bag of peas. Still there, still cold. Helen would have smiled at that. I whispered to her the way I do when the house is dark. You were right. You left me tools. You did not leave me alone. The whisper steadied the space inside my ribs where anger had burned earlier. He outlined the next steps in a steady voice. Notices to the banks and to any title company that might be approached. A letter to the recorder's office adding an instruction that my signature on any transfer be witnessed at a bank branch. A request to the credit bureaus for physical mail confirmation on any address change. He would also prepare an affidavit concerning the rumor campaign and keep it in a drawer, ready to file if necessary. He asked again whether I wanted to pursue criminal referrals. I told him not yet. He said we would keep the fuse dry and the paperwork ready. Back at the house, I ate soup at the counter and watched the street from the kitchen window. The phone stayed mostly silent, but one voicemail stood out. A man from a title office asked for a quick callback to confirm details about a pending inquiry. I forwarded the message to Thomas with one line, "Not me." He replied with 3 words, "Nice catch, George." At 4, a sedan rolled past slow enough to read my house number twice. At 5, Laura sent a text. "You've made this ugly. I wrote and deleted 3 answers. 3. I settled on 6 honest words. I will not be managed by you. I sat down and wrote the names of everyone helping me. Thomas and his assistant, the branch manager who set the flags, Mrs. Patterson, who spoke gently, and Helen, whose small handwriting started all of this. Then I called Emily to hear a bright voice. I didn't tell her the battle. I let her talk about her day until my breathing matched her kindness. Before bed, I placed the blue envelope from Thomas, my fresh packet, and the index card where I had written, "Tomorrow, the tide turns into the fire safe." I shut the door on the safe and waited for the tumblers to tell me they were done. Upstairs, I looked at Helen's empty chair, then at the small watchback plate resting on a saucer like a coin from an old country. I spoke into the quiet. They thought I was weak. Now they will see the cost of underestimating me. Sleep came like a good decision. Dawn pressed its palm against the blinds, and I went for the paper. An envelope without a return address lay on the step. Inside was a copy of a listing agreement for my house, unsigned, with a sticky note that read, "Thought you might be ready soon." The agent's card was clipped to the corner. I smiled without humor and set it on the table with the others. I poured coffee and watched the street wake up. A jogger in a knit hat. A mail truck. Mrs. Patterson was shaking seed into a feeder and looking over as if to check that I was still there and still myself. I raised the mug toward her, and she did the same. Behind me, the folder waited. Ahead of me, the next step stood like stones in a shallow stream. I breathed in and out and said the sentence that has become my compass. They don't know I'm holding the one thing that will change everything. My hands were calm, my breath even, my purpose clear as the winter light today. Then I picked up the phone and called Thomas, because turning a tide is simple work when you do it one careful wave at a time. I woke the next morning with the same thought that had carried me into sleep. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. The echoes of yesterday's confrontation clung to the walls of my house, but the weight of fear was gone. What remained was clarity, and in that clarity came the work of resolution. The folder of documents I had compiled with Thomas Chen was now more than a shield. It was a sword, and its edge had already cut through the web Laura and Brian had spun around me. Now the consequences would begin, and they would not belong to me. Within a week, the world that Laura and Brian had built on lies began to collapse. The first tremor came as a knock on the door, not from them this time, but from two federal agents in plain suits. Their questions were precise, their tone professional, but beneath every word lay the certainty that they already knew the answers. They asked about Sullivan investments, about deposits that moved too quickly, about money shifted offshore through Cayman accounts that Helen had once protected, but which Brian had tried to access. I handed them the folder of evidence, my hand steady. The slip of paper from the Rolex, the bank confirmations, the letter from Thomas, and the timeline I had written in plain language. They thanked me with the solemn nod of men who had seen too many families poisoned by greed. When they left, I felt the air in the house grow lighter. 2 days later, the IRS froze the accounts tied to Sullivan Investments. By Friday, news spread through the neighborhood that Brian had been taken in for questioning about gambling debts and fraudulent transfers. Laura was seen crying outside their house as movers hauled out furniture under the watch of deputies. The very people who had once whispered that I was losing my mind were now whispering something different, that George Sullivan had stood firm, that he had fought back. That truth had caught up with the very children who thought they could write me off as weak. I watched it unfold with a strange mix of sorrow and satisfaction. I did not take joy in seeing my daughter's name attached to a scandal, but neither did I weep for her. She had chosen this path, each lie and each manipulation a stone she placed under her own feet until the path led straight to ruin. The lesson was not mine to learn. It was hers. Meanwhile, I began the work of reclaiming my life. I called Thomas and authorized a transfer. $1 million from the Cayman account Helen had protected would go into a charitable foundation in her name. We called it the Helen Memorial Fund for Children, and its first project was a wing at the Chicago Community Hospital that would carry her name above the entrance. I wanted her kindness, her steadiness, to live in the world long after my anger was gone. Standing at the dedication a few months later, watching nurses and doctors walk under her name, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been bound since the day Laura sold her mother's watch. With the rest of the funds secure, I made a choice that surprised even me. I sold the big house. The same house Laura had tried to pry from me became the gift I gave myself. It sold for $605,000, every plank and every nail accounted for, every memory locked in my heart rather than in those walls. I bought a smaller condo overlooking Lake Michigan for $250,000. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. From the balcony, I could watch the water shift from steel gray to silver under the morning sun. At night, the city lights blinked like distant campfires. It was quiet. It was free. It was home. Friends asked if I felt lonely. I told them no. Loneliness comes from being unseen, from being dismissed, from being used. In my new home, I felt seen by Helen in every memory, and I felt seen by myself, at last, as a man who had drawn a boundary and kept it. I learned to make coffee in the mornings without rushing. I walked along the lakefront path and breathed air that was mine alone. I even dusted off Helen's old typewriter and began writing short reflections, things I had carried for years but never put into words. Each page was a way of saying, I am still here and I matter. Laura and Brian's downfall continued in ways I did not celebrate but also did not mourn. They lost their house, their bank accounts, and their reputation. Brian faced fraud charges. Laura, though spared prison, carried the weight of being known in the community as the daughter who betrayed her father. Neighbors who once listened to her stories about my supposed confusion now crossed the street rather than wave. Friends who once dined with her stopped returning her calls. Greed had given her temporary power, but it had cost her permanence. One evening, she called me from an unfamiliar number. Her voice trembled, softer than it had been in years. She said she was sorry, that she hadn't meant for things to spiral the way they had. She asked if we could meet, if I could help her through this. For a long time, I listened, letting the silence stretch. Then I spoke. I told her I hoped one day she would find her way back to the values her mother lived by. I told her I forgave her in my heart, but forgiveness did not mean reunion. I told her I would not meet, not now, not in the future. The line went quiet. Then she whispered something I could not fully catch before the call ended. I stood by the window for a long time afterward, watching the lake. I did not feel guilt. I felt clarity. I had learned that sometimes protecting yourself means closing doors that others would prefer to stay open. Family is not a free pass to wound. Love does not mean handing over your dignity. I repeated the words softly to myself. I don't need them anymore. I have myself. The sentence was simple, but it tasted like freedom. In the weeks that followed, I found joy in small things I had long ignored. I joined a group of retirees who volunteered at the community garden. We planted tomatoes and beans, laughing when the rabbits stole our harvest. I began tutoring math at the local library, helping kids who reminded me of Laura when she was young, before entitlement crept into her smile. They looked at me with trust, not suspicion, and I realized I still had something to give. The contrast between my peace and Laura's collapse could not have been sharper. While I stood in a hospital wing with Helen's name etched in stone, Laura stood in a courtroom while reporters jotted down her every word. While I bought a condo with sunlight pouring in each morning, she rented a small apartment where the blinds never quite closed. While I tended to green plants on the balcony, she tended to lawyers and debts. That was the cost of her choices, and it was a cost I would not pay for her. Looking back, I see the arc of this story clearly. At first, I was the grieving widower, blindsided by betrayal, treated as disposable by the very child I had raised. Then I was the man who discovered Helen's final gift, the man who turned grief into action. And now I am the man who has found his footing again, not in wealth alone, but in dignity, in boundaries, in truth. The lesson is as sharp as any I have ever learned. For parents like me, the lesson is this: love your children, yes, but never abandon your own protection. Do not confuse sacrifice with surrender. The money you save, the house you build, the life you've earned, it belongs first to you, and protecting it is not selfish. It is survival. For children, the lesson is just as stark. A parent's love is not a blank check. Respect is earned, gratitude is lived, and betrayal carries a cost that cannot be undone. When you betray those who gave you everything, you do not just lose money, you lose trust, and trust is the one currency that cannot be replenished once it is spent. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. And for all of us, in this fractured modern world, the lesson is about the nature of greed. Greed blinds. It convinces people that blood is simply a stepping stone. But truth waits, justice waits, and when it comes with a weight heavier than money can carry. Now, in my condo by the lake, I wake each day with a lighter heart. I make my coffee, I water the small plants on the balcony. Sometimes I sit and read Helen's old letters, and I smile rather than weep. I tell myself quietly, I am free. I mean it. For the first time in years, I mean it. As spring warmed the air, I took a step I had been considering since the hospital wing opened. I joined a charity group that mentors young people. On my first evening there, Emily, my granddaughter, walked through the door. She had signed up on her own, looking for something steady to hold on to after her parents' collapse. When she saw me, her face lit with something I thought I had lost forever: trust. We embraced, and in that moment I felt Helen's hand on my shoulder as if to say, "See, love finds its way back." That night, when I returned home and set my keys on the table, I whispered into the quiet, "Helen, I did it. I protected what we built. I kept your memory alive. And I'm free." The lake shimmered beyond the balcony, calm and endless. I closed the curtains and went to bed, ready not just for rest, but for whatever tomorrow might bring. The chapter of betrayal was over. The chapter of peace had begun. And somewhere inside, I knew the story wasn't finished. Not yet. There was still more to live, more to give, more to learn. Tomorrow I will walk into it with my head high. The condo has grown into my sanctuary. Each morning when the sun spills across Lake Michigan and turns the water into silver glass, I step out onto the balcony with a cup of coffee and whisper to myself, "This is peace." The condo isn't grand, just 2 bedrooms and a modest kitchen, but every corner carries freedom. I bought it for $250,000, a fraction of what my old house was worth. Yet somehow it feels richer because it belongs entirely to me, not to memories tainted by betrayal. I keep Helen's photograph on the bookshelf by the window, the light catching her smile, reminding me daily that she's still guiding me. Life here moves at a different pace. I've joined a volunteer group that tends to a community garden, and my hands, once tight from paperwork and worry, are now busy planting tomatoes and basil. The neighbors here don't look at me with suspicion or pity. They look at me as a man who contributes, who belongs. I've started helping out at the library, tutoring kids in math, and I find joy in their laughter, their stubborn questions, and their eagerness to learn. They look at me with trust, and in their eyes I see a reflection of the father I once tried to be to Laura before greed pulled her away. The outcome of Laura and Brian's choices has traveled fast through the city. They lost everything: the house, the accounts, the friends who once gathered at their table. When Brian was sentenced for fraud and gambling debts, and Laura faced charges of complicity, their names appeared in the paper, no longer associated with success, but with shame. They now live in a cramped apartment, waiting for appeals, their phone calls ignored by people who once answered quickly. A letter arrived for me a month ago, signed in Laura's hand. It was full of apologies, begging for forgiveness, asking if we could sit down and talk. I held it for a long while, then placed it back in the envelope and into the drawer. I didn't need to answer. Silence was my answer. I don't need their apology, I told myself. I have my life. That sentence has become my truth. And then, in the midst of this new rhythm, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Emily stood there. She had grown taller since I last saw her, but her eyes, Helen's eyes, were the same. Tears welled as she stepped forward and whispered, "Grandpa, I miss you. I'm not like Mom and Dad. I don't want to lose you, too." I pulled her into my arms, and in that embrace I felt the thread of family that remained, fragile but real. She spent the evening with me, telling me about school, about friends, about how hard it has been watching her parents fall apart. She said she always knew something was wrong, but didn't have the words to fight it. We sat together eating soup at the small kitchen table, and for the first time in months, laughter filled my home again. That night, I lay in bed thinking about Emily. She was proof that even in the ashes of betrayal, some sparks of love survive. I realized Helen would have wanted me to protect that spark, to water it carefully. And so I decided Emily would always have a place here, not in my condo necessarily, but in my heart, in my life. I whispered to Helen's photograph, "We haven't lost everything. We still have her." As for me, each day feels lighter. I wake with no dread, no fear of manipulation, no burden of carrying the lies of others. My accounts are secure, my lawyer handles the rest, and I focus on the things that matter. reading, walking the lakeside path, tending the garden, and giving my time to children who actually appreciate it. I find myself smiling more, not the forced smile I used to wear when Laura stood in my living room demanding papers, but a genuine smile born of gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for peace, for freedom. I've learned lessons I never thought I would need to learn. For parents, the lesson is simple but vital. Love your children, yes, but protect yourself too. Don't assume your sacrifices will guarantee their gratitude. Guard your dignity, your finances, your rights. Your love should never blind you to the reality that some children, no matter how they were raised, will choose greed over loyalty. For children, the lesson is harsher. A parent's love is not infinite in the face of betrayal. When you break trust, when you treat a parent like a stepping stone for wealth, you destroy something that can never be restored. And for all of us living in this modern world, the truth is plain. Greed is still alive, and always will be. But so is justice, and justice, even if it moves slowly, always catches up. Sometimes, as I sit on the balcony watching the water, I think about Laura and Brian in their small apartment. I picture them reading each other's bitterness, trying to stitch their pride back together with nothing left to use. I wonder if they've learned anything. Maybe they have. Maybe they haven't. It doesn't matter. Their story is theirs now. Mine is mine. And I intend to live mine in peace. A week ago, while cleaning my desk, I found Helen's old leather-bound notebook tucked beneath some tax papers. Inside, on one of the last pages, she had written in her careful handwriting, "Dignity is the last gift we give ourselves. Protect it, George." I traced the letters with my fingers, and I felt as if she were still here, guiding me. That notebook now sits on the shelf next to her photograph, and I read that line each morning. It centers me. It reminds me. I no longer wait for phone calls or letters. I no longer expect reconciliation. I don't need it. What I have is better. My own peace, my independence, my sense of self. I tend to my plants, I walk by the lake, I meet friends at the garden, and I share meals with Emily when she visits. My world is smaller, perhaps, but it is honest, and honesty is more than enough. The story of betrayal that began with a Rolex watch and a hidden account has ended with something greater than money. It ended with dignity, with freedom, with truth. I learned that family is not just blood. Family is the people who respect you, who love you without taking, who stand with you instead of against you. That is the family worth keeping. That is the family Helen would have wanted me to cherish. As I finish this chapter of my life, I know one thing for certain. Character is the one asset no one can steal, not even the people closest to you. Houses can be sold, accounts can be frozen, reputations can be attacked. But dignity, once claimed, remains yours forever. That is the inheritance I carry now, the only one that matters. So I close this part of the story with a simple truth. I don't need Laura and Brian anymore. I have myself. I have Helen's memory. I have Emily's trust. And I have a life that is finally mine. Each day I wake and breathe in the lake air. I know I chose right. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.